Welcome to another session of the Net Zero Carbon Summit. Aviation contributes about 2% to global carbon dioxide emissions, according to the International Energy Association, but is one of the most challenging sectors to decarbonize. Despite reductions in flying during COVID-19 lockdowns, demand is expected to grow rapidly through 2030 and beyond. New aircraft, airlines are, buying new aircraft, but that can be about 20% more efficient than the models they replace. But growth in activity has historically outpaced efficiency improvement. Technology innovation is needed across the sector, including in production of low-emission fuels, improvement in aircraft and engines, and operational optimization to get to net zero emissions by 2050. In the meantime, the industry is looking towards sustainable aviation fuels to reduce its emissions footprint and serve as a bridge to new technologies. But it will require huge public-private investment in infrastructure, and there's very little capacity now to produce that. My next guest is Mike Kramer, CEO of NOVADev, a California startup working on an ultra-efficient aircraft design with an eye towards hydrogen propulsion. Michael, welcome to our FreightWaves virtual event.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Let's start by using your expertise to explain the difference between net zero and zero carbon emissions. The industry has set a goal for net zero carbon by 2050. And one of the big ways to get there is with sustainable aviation fuels, which are, can be made in various ways with biomass and other things. What are reasonable expectations for SAF, and what is the difference between those ways of calculating carbon?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, let's explain the difference between net zero and zero carbon. Zero carbon means that there's no carbon anywhere in the life cycle of that fuel. That means there's no carbon introduced while you make it, there's no carbon introduced when you transport it, and then there's no carbon produced when you use it to fly the airplane. Right now, the only fuel that's really truly zero carbon is hydrogen that's made from green energy. When you talk about SAF, the goal is net zero. The idea being is, can I take carbon that's already out there, like CO2 from the air, or leftover from, let's say biomass that's left over from farming, take that carbon, recycle that carbon into a fuel that I can fly the airplane on, with the goal of not zero carbon, but can I reuse that carbon? I'm not introducing more carbon in the environment.
Do you think SAF, will really do much to, improve the environmental footprint of the airline industry, either as a blended with jet fuel or eventually as the primary fuel?
Yeah, I mean, SAF's a really important part of it. As part of our business plan, by the way, in addition to the pure hydrogen aircraft, we're also having a model with SAF. SAF is going to be a bridge fuel, but it's going to continue for a long time. There's going to be applications where SAF is going to be flying airplanes 20, 30, 40 years from now. There's things you can do with hydrogen and places in the world where hydrogen is going to be very cost effective, but there's a lot of areas where SAF is really going to be the right answer. With SAF, you can reduce carbon 10, 20, 30% from existing. But remember, you're taking that carbon from the ground and you're still putting it up in the air with other pollutants.
So at 30,000 feet, does the way SAF burns or whatever, does the burning SAF or sustainable aviation fuels at ground level versus high up in the atmosphere, does that change the carbon burn or emissions?
Doesn't change the carbon burn. It just changes where the CO2 is. CO2 in the upper atmosphere behaves differently. I'm not a chemist or a weather guy, but the CO2 up in the upper atmosphere is really where the greenhouse gases are coming from, the greenhouse effects, excuse me. It's not from the CO2 on the ground.
Yeah, so you're delivering it basically closer to where it's damaging.
And also remember, SAF is jet fuel. It's just a different way of getting there. It burns like jet fuel. It produces a lot of the emissions, good and bad, that you get from jet fuel. SAF can be a little cleaner, but SAF isn't the same as hydrogen as far as clean and zero.
So let's talk a little bit about hydrogen. Hydrogen is kind of a further out technology. Airbus and other technology companies are looking at or developing hydrogen propulsion, but that seems to be kind of a little bit more over the horizon, at least a decade away, to get some test flights going. how does a hydrogen plane work, and what would it cost to operate?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. First of all, when you talk about a hydrogen plane, it starts with how do you store the hydrogen? Then how do you convert that hydrogen into something useful that you can do to fly the airplane? How do you turn it into propulsion? So with hydrogen right now, there's really two major and a couple other ways of storing it. The way that smaller aircraft, these small regional and urban air mobility are storing it is in high pressure cylinders. These are very, very similar to the cylinders that are being used for trucks. So it's a high pressure gas. Problem with that is those tanks are heavy, and hydrogen isn't great from a volume standpoint. It takes up a lot of room. So an alternate way of storing that is as a liquid. Liquid hydrogen is more dense. You still would need about 3 times the volume of jet fuel, but it's a lot better than gas. There's issues with liquid hydrogen. It's difficult to handle and carry. We're using a technology that we licensed from NASA for solid state hydrogen, which is a little different. So that's another way of carrying it. So now I've got hydrogen on my airplane. What do I do with it? So there's kind of 2 schools of thought. One school of thought is using a fuel cell. Again, this is very much aligned with what the long distance truck guys are doing. I chemically combine hydrogen with oxygen from the air, and I produce water and electricity. So once I have that electricity, I can use it to drive a motor. There's a lot of people looking at that for aviation. Problem with that technology is it's heavy and it produces a lot of heat, and it's hard to get rid of heat in an airplane, surprisingly. So the other way to produce energy is burning the hydrogen in a gas turbine. The very first gas turbines ever built used hydrogen, never tried to put gas or jet fuel in. So we know it works. But what we're doing is we're taking hydrogen, burning it in a turbine to produce electricity, and we're using turboelectric is what we call it. So the turbine produces electricity, and we're using that electricity to drive propulsors, big rotors, to fly the airplane.
Right. I think I've seen an image of you have these propulsors along a kind of an a raised wing, and more of these kind of propulsors along the top. So kind of a novel design. I should add the air cargo sector is mostly going along for the ride. It's very dependent on the manufacturers and airlines to adjust the engines and the fuel. And some airlines are offering SAF if the customer logistics companies pitch in and pay the higher cost. But NOVADev is developing an alternative for standard and large commercial jets that eventually can transition to these hydrogen technologies. So you say that's where the biggest use case is, that the largest fuel burn, and that small aircraft and electrical lift, vertical takeoff and lift aircraft only address the issue on the margins, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, just to put it in simple terms, we've all flown 737s, A320s, these single aisle airplanes. That's half of the pollution that's out there. Things smaller than that, these regional and urban air mobility, is a small fraction, like 1%. So if you're trying to do these changes to save the environment, you got to go where the environment is being hurt, and it's in these bigger airplanes. From a cargo standpoint, that 767, 757, A330 type cargo airplane, that's the mainstay of the big cargo people like FedEx, UPS, DHL. They've got larger, longer aircraft, but the majority of their fleet are these mid-size airplanes. Let me add one thing too, by the way, that's important to note. Historically, cargo airplanes have been passenger airplanes that they take the seats out. They're designed around the elbows. They've got these nice curved tops. You can put a box in it for the same reason you could use a Greyhound bus to carry packages if you needed to, but it was never designed for it. So one of the things that we're also doing is trying to optimize this. The aircraft we're developing for cargo are designed around rectangular cargo containers. So what we're trying to do is also break that dependence on buying old, never designed to carry cargo airplanes and producing a product that's ideal for freight.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What else? So you got the rotor design, the turbofan propulsors on the exterior along the wing. You've got kind of a different cargo design that can take containerized freight that makes it more. Those are the main efficiency improvements, and then using hydrogen, right?
Yeah, high level of automation too. Automating the freight process. It's really interesting when you look at air freight's been around for about 60 years since somebody first put a jet air freight, excuse me. It's been around for about 60 years. 60 years ago, we were still loading ships by hand. Yeah, you picture the old movies with the guys with the hooks, carrying and dropping stuff in. Malcolm McLean said, hey, that doesn't make any sense. Let's do a standard container that's intermodal. And where I live in Southern California, I walk down to the beach and I see these container ships. We know what cargo looks like on a ship. On airplane, it looks the same as it did in 1959. So one of the fundamental changes we're doing is to try and use that model like ocean containers. Needless to say, they're a little smaller and a little lighter than a typical ocean container. But this whole idea of intermodal cargo that can be heavily automated, really hard to do that with an airplane designed for passengers.
You said that it makes more sense to develop an alternative energy freighter than a passenger jet. Why? Why is that? Does that have to do with where the limited fueling infrastructure is?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons for that. So let's talk about them. One reason is the way cargo airplanes fly. The routes are different. Cargo airplanes, not always, but typically fly from a hub. Picture Indianapolis or Memphis for FedEx, great example. They go out to spokes. They sit at that spoke for a couple of hours or overnight, and then they come back to the hub. Passenger airplanes a lot of times do loops. If you ever find Southwest Airlines, that airplane might hit 8 stops before it goes back home. As far as the infrastructure for hydrogen goes, it just makes it simpler for cargo. The other thing with cargo is you have a small number of folks that have a large number of aircraft. Again, we know who the big cargo aircraft companies are, cargo aircraft operators are. They have a bigger investment to do that. They can leverage that into these mega hubs. Again, Indianapolis for FedEx is just ideal for something like that. So why cargo? Number one, they need new aircraft. I talked about that. We're going to want to develop airplanes that are designed for cargo. Might as well have hydrogen and SAF as an option in that cargo plane. Number two, the reach structure just lends itself better to hydrogen. Number three, from a cost standpoint, these companies are more in control of their fuel cost in a strange sort of way than a lot of the passenger operators.
What's you're an early stage startup right now. What is your expected time frame to bring a prototype out, and then eventually to get to some kind of startup or full commercialization?
Yeah, so we've been working at it for about 3 years. To date, it's all been development, design work, analysis, route analysis. Our expectation is by 2032, we'll have the SAF version out, and 2034, the hydrogen version. And again, just to put that in perspective, this is an airplane that's a replacement for the 757 freighter and a good chunk of the 767 and A330 freighter market.
How will you have a hydrogen plane in 2034? Airbus has said they might not even have a plane until 2035, and I'm not even sure what that would look like.
Yeah, it's tough for the big primes. So if you think about it, if you're a Boeing or an Airbus, even an Embraer or some of the smaller ones, you've got a production line that's going. It's very disruptive for them to try and put a new aircraft in. The other thing is for a commercial passenger airline, that infrastructure is going to be a lot more challenging. The reason why we think we can do it quicker is, number one, an airplane designed strictly for a cargo airplane from the get-go is easier to do. It's a simpler airplane, still flying at the same speeds and altitudes, but all of that certification, all that passenger stuff goes away. Number two, all we are is hydrogen and SAF. We don't have to worry about stepping on toes of people with existing orders. Kind of like how Tesla was able to come out with an electric car much quicker than Ford or Nissan or Toyota, because they weren't worried about their existing markets.
Right. Good point. And one last question. What kind of regulatory pressure or incentives do you see to kind of push along decarbonization in aviation, either with SAF or hydrogen?
Yeah, there's a lot. Right now, one of the issues that aviation has is nobody pays for the pollution. Picture if you just took your garbage can and dumped it over the fence to the neighbor. Don't bother me, it's somebody else's problem. Well, with the pollution coming from aviation, and when I say pollution, I'm not just talking the greenhouse gases, I'm talking about the soot, the particulate mass. These things are just aren't good for you. You're going to have to start paying for that. You're seeing that in Europe already, where they're looking to regulate it, tax it, cap it. So the pressures are going to start coming from both investors saying, hey, if I invest in your company, if you're a big transportation company, we need to make sure that you're being environmentally friendly, but also from the regulatory agencies in Europe and in America. So you're going to have to start paying for your pollution. If you have to start paying for throwing the trash over the fence in the backyard, yeah, it gets a little more expensive to get rid of it. And you might want to do something different.
Good point. Fascinating conversation, Mike. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you for being our guest today. And for everyone else, stay tuned for more of the Net Zero Carbon Summit.
Thanks, Eric.